What pushes a 19-year-old to go and have an expedition out in the wilderness?
Had this idea of finding a place that was so remote and live cut off from civilization. I dreamt about this so much. Actually wrote a story about it when I was 12 or 13 about running away and living in Canada in a log cabin. And I never really pursued this dream. However, it just kind of manifested itself over time. You often hear kind of how that happens, and I witnessed that, and ended up meeting a person who built a log cabin in the middle of the Canadian wilderness. And the second I met him, I told him, I said, I have to go to this place. In fact, that's how I introduced myself when I met him. I heard he had built this place, and I said, I've got to go there. And 2 years later, there I was. So it really, really was just this passion of loving the outdoors and, skills that came with it and wanting to not really put those to the test, but just to understand, I guess, what it feels like to live cut off from the rest of the world in the middle of the wilderness.
How do you mentally prepare yourself to go and do something like that? Because, like, when you've explained it, there genuinely is no real civilization around this cabin at all, is there?
No, there's not. In fact, it's pretty much a guarantee that if you go there, you're not going to see anyone else. Period. We didn't see anybody else other than those that we were expecting to see for that full year. And as far as mentally preparing for that, I feel as though I'd been preparing for it my whole life. Telling your parents that you're going to go live in the wilderness for a year and they're not going to have any contact with you for a year, it didn't mean very much to me. It didn't seem like a big deal. As a 19-year-old, you're invincible and all that stuff. But looking at it now through the eyes of an adult, and I realize how lucky I was to have parents that fully supported it and said, yeah, you have to do this. This is what you were meant to do. And they embraced the idea. So I believed prior to going in that I was mentally prepared. And of course, when you go into such an experience, you're never really prepared. I mean, you maybe think that you are, but yeah, you find out pretty quickly that you've got a lot to learn.
When I hear of people that do these expeditions, or those people that go on like the 4-day hunting trips and they're just out there by themselves with their shotgun, hoping just to kill something, what are you eating out there? Are you hunting what you eat, or is there something just odd and weird you have to take with you that's going to hold you over and make sure you don't starve?
Yeah, it's a good question. First off, we after I met the person who owned this cabin, we had about 2 years of planning that we went through that included, the owner of the cabin. His name is Dr. Forgy. He's written numerous books on wilderness medicine and is really an authority on the subject. And he was interested in medical training in remote locations. And so there was a lot of prep going into it. We brought in with us on that initial trip, we brought in about 1,800 pounds of food and provisions. And the food that we had was mostly, there was a lot of freeze dried food. There was a lot of staples like flour, salt, sugar, that sort of thing. The one thing we were kind of lacking was fresh meat. So a lot of our protein was either, something that we, like fresh fish or any game that we could hunt. I assumed there would just be game everywhere, shit running around all over the place. And really, it's the game up there is pretty elusive, but there's a lot of grouse. There's a lot of snowshoe hares, and of course, moose, bears, fish, more fish than you could know what to do with. So there was plenty to kind of supplement the rather starchy diet.
What was the weirdest thing you ate? And be honest now too, was it actually
Oh,
good? Or
I've got a good one. I've got a good
are you
one for
just
you.
be honest, was it good, or were you just toughing it out to impress your friend?
I've got a good one. So just again, being interested in kind of Native Americans and their lifestyle and how they existed, Indians on the plains would, when they would kill a buffalo, they would eat the tongue like on the spot. It was like the best, most choice piece of meat. And I didn't quite have the guts to just do that, to go raw on that. So, but we did, we did take the tongue and cooked it that night. And the problem was we didn't really know how to prepare that. We just kind of threw it in a pan like you would a steak or something. And this thing curled up like a piece of shoe leather, and it was awful. It was really bad. It was not good at all. But again, I think in part because we just didn't really know how on earth to prepare something like that. I feel bad because I'm guessing if you knew how to prepare that, it would probably be a pretty tasty piece of meat, but ours tasted like a sandal, so it was not very good.
Was there anything out there that tried to kill you, maybe animal or disease wise, frostbite, stuff like that?
Aside from the environment itself, the environment's always trying to kill you. You know, it's waiting for you to make some stupid human mistake. And so the cold definitely was the biggest threat. As far as like wildlife, teams of guys that had gone up there before us, and some stayed for a couple months or a few months, and they had a lot of encounters with bears. In fact, two of those groups ended up shooting bears while they were out. We saw one bear the entire time. We never had any bear issues. We did see occasionally, like in the winter, we would see fresh wolf tracks where a pack of wolves had just kind of crossed, not very far in front of right in front of our cabin. And of course, you don't know they're even there. They're so elusive. Never saw a wolf while we were up there. So there was really no wildlife necessarily. Maybe aside from mosquitoes, again, are, another one of those great killing machines. Those things definitely took a toll on us. But I think really just the environment and what that environment does to you mentally, that those two things I think definitely try to kill you.
Yeah, I want to keep in mind the physical and the mental challenge when I ask this next question. But was there ever a moment that you genuinely sat and thought that you might not did it make it through this expedition?
The first night out is far and away the closest we came to dying, which, when you've planned on a trip like this for 2 years, when you've spent most of your childhood kind of building yourself up for this, and you go out and the very first night you almost die, it's quite a shock. Resets how you view this experience and the greatest lesson I think that we took away from nearly dying is humility and being humble. We went in not arrogant, we weren't foolish enough to be like, oh, we're going to conquer the wilderness. You're 19 years old. You're at the top of your game. So we were pretty cocky. And I think that whole first week was Mother Nature's way of establishing a hierarchy and letting us know who was in charge, and telling us like, look, we're going to be roommates for a while here. So you're going to have to understand who is the boss. And if I want to dust you off, I'll dust you. I'll just leave you there on the side of the river. So it was a really powerful lesson to take away. And in fact, anytime we would talk about this a lot while we were up there, just how profound coming that close to death was, and how it kind of reset our mental attitude toward the whole experience.
Has your perception of discomfort changed since this experiment? Maybe not directly after you came back, but even now when you reflect on it, does your perception of it change a little bit?
We, I think, acclimatized a little. We became a little more used to, because the winters up there they average around 20 below, and we became quite used to that, and certainly had the right gear for it. But I don't think it's really changed how I view comfort necessarily. I think no, not necessarily. You would think that it would, but I don't think that it did necessarily.
Do you think it didn't teach you anything because you were kind of mentally preparing for this your whole life before you went? So you knew what you were getting into?
Yeah, maybe. Again, no matter how much you prepare, you can never really. There's this great saying that map is not the country. You can look at a map and you could see all the features, you could see all the landmarks, but it's not until you step into that country that you really understand what you're getting into. And while I'd spent most of my life in the outdoors, I'd never been in the subarctic of northern Canada. So this was a first for me. So you can definitely prepare, but it's not until you step out into those temperatures, into that landscape, that you really fully appreciate kind of where you are and what you're getting yourself into potentially.
What did the isolation of the whole experiment teach you about yourself that you don't think you would have really got from modern life if you'd have just stayed home for that year?
Prior to the digital age that we're in now, we went up before that whole digital revolution really kicked off. So we went there in 1991. So we didn't we weren't dealing with some of the digital things that we're dealing with now, where we're just addicted to our tech and all of that. So we did have that benefit, that added luxury. So isolation was a little more easy to embrace. It provides luxury in that you can kind of be alone with your thoughts, which I think for some is a really terrifying concept. But you learn about yourself. You learn kind of what you're capable of and what you can tolerate. And so isolation in the wintertime in the subarctic is very much isolation. Like it's very deep isolation. In the summer months, there's so much activity, there's so much life that, you're kind of constantly busy, or you should be at least. If you don't have activity or don't have things to do, the boredom can really quickly break you down, and you start believing that everyone else that you know back home they're rapidly advancing through life and you're just standing here in the middle of the woods doing nothing. So these are the traps that you can easily fall into. So, staying active, staying busy, those things really help make the isolation more enjoyable and something to appreciate rather than loathe.
You spoke earlier about how in the first week you just almost had to put an end to the experiment because you almost died. So, do you think that as human beings we underestimate what we're capable of actually getting through? Because right at the start of this thing, you're building up for so long, almost comes to an end, but you still manage to get through it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we have to fly from Thompson, Manitoba to a small lake that's about 3 miles from the cabin. And then we have to sled our gear over. We departed in January, primarily because it was easier to transport gear. And that very first night ended up, to make a long story short, we ended up being lost and having to build a shelter to survive in. The temperatures were hovering right around, probably, we don't know exactly, but around 45 below or 50 below, something in that range. And oddly enough, I don't recall being afraid at that moment. I don't recall feeling as though, oh my God, we're not going to make it through this, even though reflecting on that now, I realize just how dangerous that situation was. I mean, we had hiked for 8 hours to get to this riverbank, even though we thought it would only take 3 or 4. We had then searched for the cabin for another 2 hours, and we're nearly hypothermic. The water that we brought across had frozen despite trying to keep it protected and insulated, and it was a dire situation. And that continued kind of throughout the course of that week. So you definitely realize like how capable you are of suffering some pretty heavy extremes, and we were lucky to come out of that alive.
I had a MMA coach on a few weeks ago, and he said something whenever we weren't recording that wish I could have got on recording because it would have been such a good thing for people to hear. But he talking about how he's got this student who athletically is not gifted at all. Like, not that talented, gets hurt a decent amount, but he is going through people like a warpath because he is beating them mentally before they even accept the fight with him. Like he's mentally destroying them. And I think about it with your experience. Like you are talking a lot about the physical challenges, like, and even the challenges you haven't spoke on yet, but like hypothermia risk, all those things. But how much of this experience and actually getting to the other side of it is actually mental.
As far as I'm concerned, it's almost all mental. Like if you can chop wood and carry water and they plant you at this cabin, you can survive, right? And you have, the necessary equipment, food. You can survive pretty comfortably, pretty easily. Mentally, it is a huge challenge because your mind can be this incredible tool, but it can also be poison. And you see, for example, on shows like Alone or these, various survival shows where it's a guy that goes in and he makes these great claims. And some of this may be just to make the show more engaging or exciting, but there's always that guy who's like, I'm never going to punch out and I'll be the last to go and they'll have to drag me out of here. And then 2 days later, you see him on their, on their knees by the side of a lake crying like a baby. And with all due respect, I mean, it can break you down like that and it can take its toll. And I don't care who you are. If you don't appreciate and believe that, you learn really quickly just how powerful your mental attitude can be.
Wrote something in my newsletter a few weeks ago. It's weird how we measure how successful or how strong someone is based on how much suffering they've gone through to get to this point. And I always think it's such a flawed way of thinking because, you don't have to go through hard times just to be strong. But in your situation, we were talking about a lot of these challenges that you overcame. It came from inner strength, things like that. Do you think it's possible to forge that inner strength without the suffering part that we all assume we have to go through?
That's a great question. Hmm. You have to suffer a bit. Your muscles, for example, if you want them to grow, you got to break them down. You've got to tear them. You've got, and so I think there's some element of that here. Like, I don't know if we would have had to suffer quite those extremes to kind of grow as much as we did, but it definitely helped. I mean, if you learn a hard lesson, it sticks with you and you grow. And that I feel is like kind of what we did.
Do you think the average man in modern times could survive what you and Scott went through?
Yeah, I do. Depending on the person. I mean, look, there's people that live in these conditions, I question, it's funny, I question myself in terms of like, could I do this again? And thinking of it now, just as kind of stewed in technology and all of these things, I think it would it would be very difficult going back for a long trip because you'd have to almost readjust yourself and reacclimatize yourself to life without those things. And it sounds simple, but it's these things are addictions, so I don't know if necessarily it would be like flipping a switch. Scott and I went back to the cabin for the last time in 2014. And A, we were older, and B, we didn't have all of the technical. When we originally went, we didn't have all this tech and all this stuff, and trying to just slow down because I feel like it takes a couple weeks at least just to kind of find a rhythm that puts you in tune with your environment. It was, and we were only there for 2 weeks, so it was almost impossible to dial into that zone. Could people do it? Certainly, they are doing it, but it's, if you were to go in there cold without maybe having any of this experience before, I think it would be a big challenge. Certainly.
Went back and mentioned about, the digital aspect and being in your phone for too long and stuff like that. And I've been trying to think on this recently, and I think you're probably the best person to ask about this. It was probably saving it originally for a different episode, but this might be the best time to ask it. What in us do you think we lose as humans when we're removed from nature for so long and we're just stuck inside?
Yeah, what a great question. And something I think about all the time, just given this experience. I think disconnecting yourself from nature I think it takes a heavy toll on you. I think we're so much a part of the natural world, right? I mean, so to pull those roots out, I think it does some harm. It's just like when you disconnect with people, there's something kind of unnatural about it. And I think finding that connection back to the natural world makes us better people. It makes us more caring and empathetic towards other people. And also it gives you, it's soul food. It gives you food for your soul. And when you stand and you see some incredible natural thing that's not on an HD screen, you can't help but reflect, or to kind of go inside yourself, stir up some of these, these feelings or these thoughts about, just taking kind of an inward journey. So yeah, it's difficult to see us becoming so disconnected from the natural world.
You obviously had a lot of faith and trust in your partner in crime in this expedition. I mean, some of these things that you've went through with him is insane, but looking back on that experience, what did you learn about trust and friendship and things like that from having to put all your faith in this guy?
You know what's amazing about Scott, who was my trip partner, Scott Bauer, while I had spent my entire life, our life revolved around the outdoors, Scott, his first time camping in a tent was just 2 years prior to going on this trip. But the great thing about him is I tend to be very logistical. I think about things. I'm cautious. I weigh everything out. Scott is very much fly by the seat of your pants. He's very enthusiastic. He's very much an extrovert, and he's all in. He's just, let's do this. Let's say this will be great. And so when he first mentioned that he wanted to do this, you know, I had to wonder a bit, like, how committed he would be, 6 months in, if he, like, would he just be like, this is ridiculous, I don't like this, and so for him to go in and take full advantage of this, and and come out really an expert outdoorsman was spectacular to me. Like, it's really, I can't think of too many people that could pull that off. And I think the best thing about our relationship was we only knew each other for 2 years prior to going in. If I had gone in with, say, a best friend, I mean, you already know all of your stories, you know each other well enough that there's not much to talk about. So that was an added benefit. And Scott and I were both really pretty laid back people. Like, we're not, we have good senses of diplomacy, I think. And so in that respect, we're able to work really well together, and our differences complemented each other.
Why did Eddie Bauer make a parka after you? And are you getting free jackets off this guy, or is he taking you for a run?
While we were kind of collecting gear, and bear in mind, like, we didn't have big sponsors. We didn't have, endless capital or funding for this. This was a bootstrap adventure. And one piece of gear that I didn't have was a good parka. And my dad offered me his Eddie Bauer parka, which was, he purchased this parka when I was born. So, there was a part of me that was a little hesitant, knowing about the critical nature of something like this. I mean, that is a critical piece of gear. But, he bought this when Eddie Bauer was really making top notch equipment. And so I took him up on it, and I took it and I beat the hell out of it. And when I came home, it looked like it had run through a lawnmower. I mean, it was just shredded and it was a mess. And I thought, I'm going to take a picture of this park and I'm going to send it to the president of Eddie Bauer and let them know that, like, this thing saved my life on more than one occasion. And I got this great letter back from him saying, if you let us take your parka, we'll hang it in our archive room and we'll send you a new one. I thought, well, I'm just going to fly out and present this to them. And I think I was also kind of bucking for, like, some sort of a job, because I, just come out of this trip and I was looking for work. And so I did. I flew out there. I had this parka. It smelled terrible, just because, I mean, all the wood smoke and all that. I mean, it was, but it's a beautiful thing, and he was so excited to see it. We looked at all the details, and then he gave me he replaced this parka. And that was the end of the story. Well, a couple of years after this, I got a call from them saying, hey, they want to recreate this parka as part of their, quote, Legends series. They had a few different people that had, interesting stories about their gear, and they wanted to use my story. So for I think it was available for a year, maybe two. They created the David Scott Parka, and I mean, it was like the coolest thing ever. They recreated this parka, and yes, they gave me several parkas as a bonus. But frankly, they were great parkas, but like there were certain little details, like the ruff around the collar was a faux fur ruff. And if you know anything about Arctic travel, like there is a reason they put actual either, Wolverine or wolf fur around these things, because the actual fur performed so incredibly well in those temperatures. So it was this huge honor to me, and they created some promotional material around it, and so it was just a very cool experience for both myself and for my dad, because I mean, obviously he was an important part of that as well.
Right. We'll get back to close out this story and what you learned about your time out there. So, was there a single lesson or moment that kind of crystallized this entire experience for you?
I think the lesson in being humble was probably the biggest lesson that I learned anyway. I mean, just, and again, not that I was cocky and arrogant going in, but like just having that respect and realizing your place in this landscape was, I feel like I knew this going in, just I'd spent so much time in the outdoors anyway, but it just really put a fine point on that lesson. And also, I would say second to that would probably be this idea of resourcefulness. Like if you forget something going in there, you've forgotten it, and you. There's nothing you can do about that. So trying to figure out ways to make or improvise or create anything that you might need became this kind of almost this badge of honor. Like I really enjoyed those that kind of problem solving and figuring those things out.
Do you have any advice you would give to someone that's kind of stuck in a cubicle life? They kind of feel like they're surrounded by walls and they can't get out of it, and they maybe want to feel alive again.
Well, I am speaking from my own experience, because being involved in my primary focus was digital advertising, and I'd spent many years after this experience kind of doing that very thing, and initially loving it, but then finding myself, as you described, kind of stuck or lost, and you know, the I think the biggest lesson, at least, and the most difficult one that I'm still struggling with, taking some action. And the problem I think that people run into is you're like, well, I don't know which way to turn. I don't know what to do, or I don't. And based on everything that I've studied and learned, the idea is what it is doesn't matter. You just need to start taking steps in some direction. And it's hard, because especially for somebody like me who's kind of, I like the logistics. I like making sure I understand kind of what I'm doing or where I'm going. And, you know, at that point in your life, those answers are not going to be there until you start stepping into them. And I think I absolutely believe it. I'm not very good at practicing it. I'm still kind of working on that myself.
So the extended story of what you done will be in the description for your book advertisement and stuff like that. But I'm thinking
Yes.
now to round out the show, putting my mind in the mind of the audience. What's something you would want people to take away from your story? Like, is it survival, simplicity, or is it just kind of stop being a bitch?
Oh boy, that's a good question. I think taking chances, doing things that, uh, because prior to going into this, I at least from a personal point of view faced a lot of criticism from people. Like, what are you doing? Like, you should be going to college, you should be moving on with your life, and if you let it, those things will control you. They will steer the course of your life. So I think, believing in what you're doing, and ignoring the criticism, because anybody that's being critical of what you're trying to do, they don't know. I mean, they're just as lost as everyone else. And I remember telling my dad, like, I don't know what I want to do, for a career. And I don't know. And he's like, Dave, he goes, I'm in my 50s. I still don't know what I want to do. So it's okay. It's like you'll figure that out. And so, kind of trying to fight your way through that criticism is important. It's staying true to what your gut and what your gut is telling you and what you believe to be true.